Thank you, everyone, for joining us here on PM Express. And let's go through some of the key issues that have emerged over the last 1 week in two separate research documents, research reports that have been published. You know, last week there was the research published by the Statistical Service and then the SRAJ. That was controversial because it really showed, and it uses a different measure, trying to track actual, perceived actual corruption, and then there's a perception part, because they were even measuring, quantifying the corruption, how much money people were paying. So that was slightly different. And then yesterday, there was an Afrobarometer report that in essence measures purely people's perception. But one thing that it showed, that is the overriding theme myself and my team got reading it, is that it showed that our democracy is in decline. And we're going to get into that pretty shortly. And one of the things that showed this is this. It is questioning about who is corrupt. The thing I want you to note when you look at this is the top three institutions perceived by people as most corrupt. In the top four. And I think that is one of the things that should alarm you wherever you are as you look at this. Because when the CDD and the Afrobarometer team went around doing the survey and asking people, what they noticed is, first, if you look at the number two, it is Office of the Presidency, so representing the executive. Number three, Members of Parliament, representing the legislature. And then number four, Judges and Magistrates, representing the judiciary. So in essence, our three arms of government are number two, number three, and number four perceived most corrupt institutions in this country. If that is not alarming, I don't know what is. But that tells you a story about, this is in essence our democratic institutions, the three of them, all arms of government are competing when it comes to who is the most corrupt. And let's look at the actual percentages that the people put up there. Most being this color, most or all. If you look at the 55 between the executive and the members of parliament, it's almost a tie. It's almost a tie. The perception of people when it comes to members of parliament and the executive. So the first two arms of government, executive and the legislature, appear to have tied in people's minds when it comes to who is most corrupt, because 55% as against 54%. It's just a 1% separation between the two. And then followed closely by judges and magistrates. That tells you a pretty worrying story, right? And that's why we're having a conversation about democracy in decline. What is attributing, what is accounting for this? And then you have the police, of course, that almost seem to always be at the top when it comes to institutions most corrupt. And there's something that I need to point out. It's very, very possible that the police is almost all the way up there, because possibly we've all stereotyped them. And so anytime they ask you a question, it's so easy that it jumps, it's that recognition is there, and people just jump at the police. Maybe it's a factor. And we've seen the IGP's very detailed, well thought through statement he issued today, challenging the findings of the other report from the Statistical Service and the SRAJ. So that's a very important thing. But this is what we'll be focusing on today. This finding here is what we'll be focusing on. How come our three institutions, the arms of government, are all up there? But let me do something that is a bit self-serving. But I need to point this out because of media. This is the Afrobarometer report. I didn't do it. You see right at the bottom of least corrupt, if you look at the percentages, right at the bottom of least corrupt, is media. Private and public media seen as two of the least corrupt, because the non-governmental organizations are seen as the least corrupt at the bottom. Right next to that is private media and public media. Does that reflect reality? I know many of you will challenge that, because the perception is pretty widespread that the media itself isn't clean, as white as snow, but that's what the research shows here. And if you look at the graph here, this tells a story. And if you look at the judge's line, which is this, what you see, I'm talking about the judiciary, because that compares judiciary, tax officials, and the police. What you see in that is that in 2014, they were doing pretty badly. And then they started doing a bit well. In the next time they measured this in 2017, they did even better in 2019. But as you see in 2020, it appears that the judiciary is beginning again the perception is beginning to worsen again when it comes to perception of corruption among the judiciary. And then you look at the police. The worst period for them was 2014, and they seem to have done something well because it's begun to dip a bit. But unfortunately this year, the Afrobarometer has picked up again that the police, this is the second highest they've scored when it comes to perception of corruption with the police. Does that suggest that maybe the interventions that the police I know have done isn't working as they should? As for tax officials, they'll always be there. Even when you look at this, you see them in 5th position as 5th most corrupt institution when it comes to perception. Let's quickly go to another thing here when it comes to perceived corruption at the presidency and among MPs. And this gives you a trend analysis. One of the key things that will jump at you when you look at the office of the president, right, is that this performance here, 55%, is the worst the office of the president has scored since 2008. That is worrying. The worst that the office of the president has scored since 2008. We are talking over 14 years. That's a long time. So the worst in 14 years. That's something that should raise a few eyebrows. Since 2008, the worst we've scored is what is currently being registered on the Afrobarometer report. The last time it was this bad was in 2014, where they scored 53%. And then you look at the members of parliament, and again, you begin to see the problem that I painted earlier. The legislature is almost competing with the executive when it comes to the perception of corruption again. And you see that playing out in there. Now, pandemic-related corruption was also measured, and this is another key thing that jumped at me when I looked at this. When they asked people, was there in essence pandemic-related corruption? A lot, 44% said there was a lot of pandemic-related corruption. And then some corruption was just 28%, a little is 11%. If you combine these three, you begin to find that above 80% of people said either there was a lot of pandemic-related corruption, some or little. And it goes to the conversation, then the controversy in Parliament about let's do an open heart surgery into how we spend the pandemic-related money, right? And another thing, level of corruption. If you look at the level of corruption currently, it is really, people believe, the question was asked, increased, as the level of corruption increased somewhat or a lot. And if you look at that, that's a 77% said level of corruption has increased somewhat or a lot. Has it decreased somewhat or a lot? And just 6% say it's decreased. So there's a significant perception that it's gone up. But I need to point out that this is not the worst we've had though in 2022. The worst is 2014 in the previous administration. 2014, 83% said corruption, the levels of corruption were this high. And this is, since the Afrobarometer survey began recording this, is the highest on record, 83% in 2014. And so I know that if you're a politician, if you're NDC, you won't like this. If you're MPP, you say, wow, I mean, yeah, we are 77%, but even our worst, it's still better than what they did in 2014. It's something that the political eyes will pick up. But that's what the evidence says in the Afrobarometer survey. Risk of retaliation for reporting corruption. There is risk of retaliation or other negative consequences. And you begin to see that in 2019, that risk is 61%, but in 2022, it's gone up to 69%, which means that people perceive, if you talk about corruption a lot, there's a risk that you will have retaliation from those who may be concerned. Evaluation of government performance in fighting corruption. Another key thing that I thought was interesting is that this government had introduced they've passed the law to form the Office of the Special Prosecutor. They created it, and then they passed the Right to Information Bill. But it's not reflecting in what people perceive how their performance have been. The evaluation has been pretty terrible, because if you look at fairly or very badly, is 85% of people say the government performance is pretty poor. That's a pretty poor number. Fairly well is just 14%. So people perceive that this government performance in fighting corruption has been very bad. And 85% is a lot of people saying that in the Afrobarometer report. And if you do the trend analysis, say in the last 10 years, you begin to see this is the worst performance in the last 10 years. Certainly the worst in this government's time, and since under this current president, since he was elected. This is the worst we've recorded in 10 years, and of course in the last 6 years or so. So that's another key thing that if you're a government person, you should be worried, if considering all the interventions, that how is it that people are perceiving that your performance is that bad. Willingness to pay taxes also showing here. People generally don't want to pay tax, and there's no surprise there that you have that. And then support for democracy and rejection of authoritarian alternative. One of the things that struck me, reject military rule, 67%. That means that you have a fair bit of people who believe, who don't reject, they do not reject military rule, right? There's a fair bit of people. Just 33% of people, they don't reject it. Does that necessarily mean that they'll welcome military rule? And what is accounting for this is one of the key questions that needs to be asked. Support for oversight of the president. Yes, president must always obey the laws and the courts. There's overwhelming majority of people believe that is what must happen in a democracy. Of course, that's what a democracy should do. Should opposition parties hold government accountable or cooperate with it? There's a view there by 45% of people that they agree strongly the opposition party should accept defeat and cooperate with government to help it develop the country. And this goes to a hung parliament. As you've seen, the government party had accused the opposition party of not helping. They were playing politics because they haven't accepted defeat from the 2020 elections. Well, 45% of people say they strongly agree that they need to accept defeat and help the government. Those who agree are in 12% there. So that should say something. But they will say, well, the overwhelming majority, a significant majority still believe otherwise. Support for media. And you begin to see that support for media is also going up. The media should have the right to publish, has gone up quite significant. That's the highest we've seen, again, in 10 years, whilst the government should have the right to prevent publication is declined quite significantly. I remember in 2017, it was pretty worrying when majority said that the government should have the right to stop us from publishing. That has improved, and which is a good thing. Support for the media's role is also going up, and that reflects in the corruption, I guess, measurement that we saw. MPs and assemblymen only sometimes or never listen, and you begin to also appreciate that MPs only sometimes ever listen. Is that the MPs again are being told by the people that they do not listen. They do not listen. 85% of people say the MPs only sometimes or never listen at all. In fact, the assemblymen are doing better. What is accounting for this? My guests will join me and tell me their thoughts on this. Rating leaders' performance. And one of the things you see, I want to show you the next graph. That is evaluation of the president's performance. The president's approval ratings is at an all-time low, because approve or strongly approve is 30%. Right? If you compare to where he was, this president, where he was in 2017 when he first took power, he was at 76%. Very, very high indeed. In fact, it's one of the highest. In the closest we've had is 2008 under Kufuor, where just before Kufuor handed over power, he was 78%, right? And in 2005, again, Kufuor scored pretty high. So when this current government, this President Akufo-Addo came in, you see how high he was scoring in his approval ratings. It only compares to Kufuor in 2005. Kufuor beat him slightly by 2 percentage points. So that was a very high score. So to drop from there to 30% currently tells its own story of where the economy is right now. And that hung Parliament, the expectations that we see there. So there's a lot. I just wanted to break down for you some of the key things before I bring in my guest. We're going to be talking to CDD's Gilfred Isiama. We'll be talking to the Ghana Bar Association. Remember the judges, they've been mentioned, the legislature. You know, the judges can't speak for themselves. So the GBA, the Ghana Bar Association, normally does. So I'm curious to hear their view on this. That constantly puts the judiciary there as one of the poorly performing institutions when it comes to corruption as well. And then we will speak to a man who understands the way Parliament works. That is the legislative arm of government. All here as we analyze why is it appearing that our democracy is in decline. Stay with me after this break.